The cold, brackish water of the Gulf of Finland hides a secret that the Soviet High Command cannot afford to ignore. It is July 1944, and the surface of the Baltic Sea is a mirror reflecting the smoke of a continent in flames. Beneath the waves lies a shattered hull that holds a weapon capable of silencing the Allied navies forever. To understand why a single sunken vessel could command the total attention of a superpower, one must first understand the peculiar, claustrophobic nature of the war in the north. The Gulf of Finland is a narrow, treacherous throat of water, stretching only a few hundred miles from the Leningrad docks to the open Baltic Sea. In the summer of 1944, this is not a place for grand armadas or the sweeping maneuvers of aircraft carriers. It is a world of shadows. The water is shallow, often no more than 100 feet deep, and the currents are unpredictable, dragging silt and debris across the seabed until visibility disappears entirely. Here, the war is defined by invisible movement. It is a landscape of dense minefields, where thousands of pounds of explosives drift just beneath the surface, waiting for the careless turn of a rudder. For the men who serve on the small Soviet patrol boats, the sea is an endless source of tension. There is no such thing as a safe passage. Every mile must be earned, and every shadow on a sonar screen is treated as a potential death sentence. The conflict here is intimate and unforgiving. Historian Sheila Fitzpatrick has often noted that the Soviet naval effort in these restricted waters was characterized by a profound sense of isolation and technical pressure. The sailors are not just fighting an enemy, they are fighting the geography itself. The Gulf of Finland is a graveyard of iron, littered with the remains of ships that strayed too far from the narrow-swept channels. In this environment, the appearance of a new threat is not merely a tactical problem, it is an existential crisis. On the afternoon of July 30, 1944, the water near the Koivisto Islands is deceptively calm. The sun hangs heavy in the sky, casting long golden reflections across the waves. It is the kind of afternoon that might, in another life, be described as peaceful. But for the crew of the Soviet submarine chaser UMO-103, there is no room for peace. The UMO-103 is a small, wooden-hulled vessel designed for speed and the delivery of a singular, violent purpose. It is a sea hunter tasked with finding the predators that lurk in the dark. The wooden hull is a deliberate design choice. It offers some protection against magnetic mines, but it provides almost no defense against the steel and fire of a German U-boat. The captain of the UMO-103, Alexander Konovalov, is a man who understands the weight of his environment. He knows that his ship is an intruder in these waters. As the vessel patrols the perimeter of a Soviet convoy route, the hydrophone operator suddenly signals a contact. It is a sharp, rhythmic pulsing, the sound of a propeller cutting through the water. It is close. To the men on the bridge, the world suddenly shrinks. The vastness of the Baltic Sea disappears, replaced by a few hundred yards of gray water. The contact is identified as an underwater vessel, moving with the slow, deliberate confidence of a hunter that believes it is unseen. Alexander Konovalov does not hesitate. He orders the UMO-103 into a high-speed run, the engines roaring as the small craft cuts through the swells. The depth charge racks at the stern are prepared. These are simple weapons, heavy metal canisters filled with high explosives, set to detonate at a specific depth. They are blunt instruments of war, relying on the crushing pressure of a waterborne shockwave to crack the pressure hull of a submarine. As the UMO-103 crosses the estimated position of the contact, the first series of charges is released. They roll into the wake, disappearing into the churned-up foam. Seconds later, the sea erupts. Great plumes of white water and black silt are thrown nearly 50 feet into the air. The shockwaves are so powerful that they rattle the wooden planks of the UMO-103, making the small ship vibrate with a terrifying intensity. After the echoes of the explosions fade, There is a moment of profound, heavy silence. The crew watches the surface, looking for the telltale signs of a kill. Slowly, a dark, shimmering slick of oil begins to spread across the waves. Bubbles of air, trapped for hours inside a steel tomb, rise to the surface and pop. Then, debris begins to float upward, scraps of wood, clothing, and the unmistakable smell of diesel fuel. The German submarine U-250, a Type 7C boat under the command of Captain Werner Karl Schmidt, has been hit. The explosions have torn through its hull, and the vessel is no longer able to maintain its buoyancy. It begins a long, slow slide toward the bottom. In these shallow waters, the journey is short. The U-250 comes to rest on the seabed at a depth of exactly 88.5 feet. It settles into the soft mud at an angle, its engines silenced, and its crew trapped in the sudden, terrifying darkness of a dying ship. For the crew of the IMO 103, the sinking of an enemy submarine is usually a cause for celebration, a rare and hard-won victory in a brutal war. But as the afternoon wears on, the mood on the Soviet ship begins to shift. There is something about this kill that feels different. It is not the way the submarine sank, but the events that preceded it that begin to trouble the naval officers. Just hours earlier, another Soviet patrol ship, the IMO 105, had been lost in these same waters. It had disappeared in an instant, a massive explosion breaking its back and sending it to the bottom before a distress signal could even be sent. When the survivors of the IMO 105 are pulled from the water, their accounts are chillingly consistent. They describe a sudden, catastrophic impact, but they all mention the same haunting detail. There was no visible torpedo wake. In the standard naval warfare of the 1940s, a torpedo is a steam-powered or electric projectile that leaves a very specific calling card. As it races toward its target, the exhaust from its engine creates a bright, white trail of bubbles and foam on the surface. For a vigilant lookout, this wake is a final, desperate warning, a chance to turn the ship and comb the tracks. But the men of the IMO 105 saw nothing. One moment, they were patrolling a quiet sea. The next, their world was ending. There was no foam, no white line cutting through the blue, and no warning from the hydrophones that a torpedo was approaching. To an experienced naval officer, this lack of a wake is more than a mystery. It is a nightmare. It suggests that the Germans have deployed a weapon that defies the established rules of engagement. If the enemy can strike without being seen, and if their weapons leave no trace of their path, then the Soviet fleet is essentially defenseless. The realization begins to take hold within the Soviet command. The sinking of the U-250 is no longer just a successful engagement. It is a potential breakthrough. If the U-250 was the ship that sank the IMO 105, then the secrets of this invisible attack are sitting at the bottom of the Gulf of Finland, less than 90 feet below the surface. The wreck is no longer a pile of twisted metal. It is a question mark that must be answered. The implications are staggering. If the Germans have perfected a torpedo that does not rely on a straight-line path or a visible wake, it means they are using a new form of guidance. In 1944, the idea of a weapon that can think or seek is the stuff of science fiction. Yet the evidence on the surface of the Baltic Sea suggests it is a reality. This is why the U-250 cannot be left to the tide and the silt. Every hour it sits on the seabed is an hour where the salt water is eating away at paper, electronics, and the very machinery that the Soviet Union needs to study. Historian Anne Applebaum has noted the intense atmosphere of technical urgency that characterized the Soviet military apparatus during this period. There was a pervasive fear that the Western Allies or the Axis powers might achieve a technological leap that would render the Soviet sacrifices on the ground irrelevant. This fear is palpable in the orders that begin to fly between the Baltic Sea Fleet headquarters and the High Command in Moscow. The U-250 is sitting in a shallow grave. but it is located in a highly contested area. Finnish coastal artillery batteries are within range, and German aircraft are constantly patrolling the skies. The site is a front line in every sense of the word. As the sun begins to set over the Gulf of Finland, the Soviet naval officers look out over the spot where the oil slick continues to rise. They know that the Germans will eventually realize one of their boats is missing. They know that the enemy will likely return to the site to ensure that no secrets can be recovered. The clock is already ticking. What started as a chance encounter between a subchaser and a U-boat has evolved into one of the most significant intelligence opportunities of the entire war. The men on the MO-103 watch the water, their eyes scanning for the return of the enemy. But their thoughts are on what lies beneath. They think of the German crew, some of whom may still be alive in the pressurized pockets of the hull. They think of the machines, the charts, and the strange, silent torpedoes that have already claimed so many lives. The Gulf of Finland has always been a place of secrets, but never before has a secret been so vital to the survival of the fleet. The wreck of the U-250 is a silent witness to a new era of warfare, and the Soviet Union is about to risk everything to make that witness speak. This is the opening of a story that would be buried for decades. It is a story of incredible physical labor, of divers working in the pitch black of the Baltic Sea mud, and of a decision-making process that prioritized information over the lives of the men tasked with retrieving it. In the summer of 1944, the war was being won in the fields of Poland and the forests of Belarus. But here, in a quiet corner of a shallow sea, a different kind of victory was being pursued. A victory of knowledge over mystery. The hunt for the U-250 had ended, but the battle for its secrets was only just beginning. As the hours stretch into days, the surface of the Gulf of Finland remains deceptively still. But beneath the waves and behind the closed doors of Soviet naval intelligence, a feverish energy is beginning to take hold. The sinking of the U-250 is no longer a localized victory to be celebrated by a single patrol boat. It has become a matter of supreme state priority. The immediate intelligence assessment begins not in the water, but in a sterile, dimly lit interrogation room where the few survivors of the German crew are being held. Among them is the submarine's commander, Captain Werner Karl Schmidt. The survivors are a rare find. In the brutal, high-pressure world of submarine warfare, the destruction of a vessel usually leaves no witnesses. But here, the Soviet officers have something far more valuable than wreckage. They have the men who operated the machines. Under intense questioning, a crucial detail emerges that changes the entire nature of the recovery effort. The U-250 was on its very first combat patrol. To a casual observer, this might seem like a minor point, but to an intelligence officer, it is a revelation of staggering proportions. A submarine on its first patrol is a floating museum of current technology. Its equipment has not been modified or scavenged. Its documents are fresh and complete. Its encryption materials are active and relevant for the weeks and months ahead. Most importantly, the speed with which the U-250 sank, plunging nearly 90 feet to the seabed in a matter of minutes, suggests that the crew had no time to execute their scuttle protocols. They could not shred the codebooks. They could not smash the glass rotors of the cipher machines. They could not dump the sensitive charts into the deep. Everything the German Navy considers most sacred is likely still sitting inside that steel hull, preserved by the very water that claimed the ship. Intelligence officers begin to construct a mental inventory of the treasures potentially resting on the seabed. They suspect that within the flooded compartments lies a complete set of minefield charts for the Gulf of Finland. In this theater of war, the Germans have spent years laying thousands of mines in intricate, overlapping patterns. These are not random obstacles. They are carefully designed iron gardens meant to bottle up the Soviet fleet. The Germans navigate these waters using secret, narrow corridors, safe passages that are invisible on any Soviet navigation map. If the divers can retrieve these charts, the entire geography of the sea will change overnight. Soviet convoys will be able to bypass deadly traps, and Soviet hunters will know exactly where to wait for the next U-boat to emerge. Beyond the maps, there is the question of communication. Every German U-boat carries a naval Enigma machine, a complex device of rotors and electrical circuits that turns ordinary words into an unbreakable wall of gibberish. However, the machine is only half of the puzzle. To read the messages, one needs the daily key settings, the codebooks that tell the operator how to configure the machine for a specific date and time. Historian Philip Short, in his studies of the era's security apparatus, notes that the Soviet Union viewed such cryptographic materials not just as tactical tools, but as strategic weapons of the highest order. Capturing an intact Enigma machine, along with its current codebooks, would allow Soviet intelligence to listen in on the private conversations of the German High Command, revealing future mine-laying operations and submarine redeployments before they even begin. But even the Enigma is overshadowed by a third layer of value: the technological mystery of the invisible torpedo. This is what truly haunts the naval planners. From the survivors' accounts and the physical evidence of the Imo-105's destruction, the Soviet Navy suspect the U-250 was carrying the T-5 Zaunkönig, known to the Allies as the Wren. This is an experimental acoustic homing torpedo. Unlike conventional weapons that travel in a straight line, the T-5 Zaunkönig is designed to listen. It possesses internal microphones that detect the specific frequency of a ship's propeller. Once it catches the scent of sound, it steers itself toward the source, adjusting its course in real time. The T-5 Zaunkönig represents a fundamental shift in the history of human conflict. For centuries, warfare was a game of sight. If you could see the enemy, you could aim at them. If they could not see you, you were safe. But the acoustic torpedo changes the rules of physics. In the dark, murky depths of the Baltic Sea, sight is irrelevant. Sound is the only reality. A weapon that can seek out its target by sound alone makes the very act of movement a liability. Every turn of a propeller becomes a beacon for destruction. To defend against such a weapon, the Soviet Union cannot simply build thicker armor or faster ships. They must understand the science of the weapon itself. They need to dissect the ears of the torpedo to learn how to deafen them. This technological intelligence is a long-term prize that outweighs the immediate tactical gains. If Soviet engineers can get their hands on an intact T-5 Zaunkönig, they can develop noise-making decoys, devices that mimic the sound of a ship but lure the torpedo away into the empty sea. This is a battle of intellect and engineering, fought with slide rules and acoustic sensors. As historian Sheila Fitzpatrick has observed, the Soviet system was uniquely obsessed with the idea of technical parity. The fear that the enemy possessed a secret weapon was a constant driver of military policy. The U-250, sitting in the mud near the Koivisto Islands, is the key to neutralizing that fear. The value of the wreck can be viewed as three distinct layers of importance. The first layer is immediate and tactical. This includes the minefield maps and patrol routes. These are the tools of the current week's war. Knowing these routes means saving thousands of tons of shipping and hundreds of lives in the next convoy. It is the kind of intelligence that pays dividends within hours of its recovery. It is grounded in the grit and blood of the Gulf of Finland, offering a way to navigate a sea that has become a graveyard. The second layer is cryptographic. This is the world of the Enigma and the radio frequencies. This intelligence has a shelf life. Codes are changed, frequencies are shifted. But for a brief window of time, the Soviet Navy could achieve total transparency. They could know where every German vessel is located, what their orders are, and when they intend to strike. In the high-stakes chess match of the Baltic Sea, this is like being able to see the opponent's hand. It offers the chance to intercept mine layers before they can drop their cargo, turning the hunter into the hunted. The third and most critical layer is the technological. This is the recovery of the T5 Zaunkönig acoustic torpedoes and the technical manuals that explain their operation. This information does not expire. Once the principles of acoustic homing are understood, that knowledge remains a permanent part of the Soviet arsenal. It allows for the creation of countermeasures that will protect the fleet for years to come. It is an investment in the future of naval warfare, a way to ensure that the Soviet Union is not left behind in the rapidly accelerating arms race of the mid-20th century. As these layers of value are analyzed, the cold logic of the Soviet High Command begins to solidify. They realize that they cannot simply send divers down to pick through the wreckage for a few choice items. The risk of losing information is too great. If a diver tries to pry open a document chest underwater, the rushing seawater might shred the fragile paper or wash away the ink. If an electronic component is removed and exposed to the air without proper preservation, the salt will begin to corrode it instantly. Most importantly, capturing individual parts of a system often means losing the context of how those parts work together. A naval cipher machine is just a box of gears without the manuals that explain its maintenance. An acoustic torpedo is just a cylinder of explosives without the wiring diagrams that reveal how its microphones are calibrated. To truly understand the enemy's secrets, the Soviet Union needs the entire system. They need to see how the charts are stored, how the radios are wired, and how the torpedoes are cradled in their tubes. The submarine must be viewed as a single, massive intelligence organism. This realization leads to a conclusion that is as ambitious as it is dangerous. They cannot simply salvage parts of the U-250. They must raise the entire submarine, all several hundred tons of it, and they must do so without breaking it apart. They must bring the vessel to the surface intact, preserving the air pockets and the dry compartments where the most sensitive secrets are hidden. It is a task that pushes the limits of contemporary engineering and human endurance. The Gulf of Finland, with its unpredictable currents and freezing temperatures, is a hostile environment for such an undertaking. The depth of nearly 90 feet is at the very edge of what divers of the era can handle for extended periods. Every minute spent on the bottom is a minute where nitrogen bubbles can form in the blood, and every movement is hampered by the heavy, restrictive diving suits of the 1940s. Yet the value of the invisible weapon and the unbreakable code is so high that the risks are deemed acceptable. The order begins to take shape. It will not be a salvage operation in the traditional sense. It will be a surgical extraction of an entire enemy weapon system from the bottom of a contested sea. The men assigned to this task will not be told the full extent of what they are looking for, but they will be made to understand that the survival of the Baltic Sea fleet depends on their success. The U-250 is no longer just a sunken boat. It is a repository of German genius and Soviet ambition, waiting in the silence of the deep. The decision has been made. The submarine will rise. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the victory in the water is replaced by a tense, quiet struggle in the corridors of power. The discovery of the U-250 has presented the Soviet High Command with a strategic dilemma that is as complex as it is dangerous. In the war rooms of the Baltic Sea Fleet, officers stare at maps where the site of the sinking is marked with a heavy red circle. It is a location that offers immense opportunity, but it is also a place where the geography of the war works entirely in the enemy's favor. The wreck lies only 88 feet below the surface, which is shallow enough for a recovery, but its proximity to the Finnish coast makes it a death trap for any Soviet vessel that lingers there. The Gulf of Finland is not a vast ocean where a ship can disappear into the horizon. It is a narrow, crowded waterway where every move is observed. The site of the U-250 is well within the range of Finnish coastal artillery batteries positioned on the nearby islands. These guns are heavy, accurate, and manned by crews who have spent years perfecting their aim against Soviet shipping. To attempt a salvage operation, the Soviet Navy would have to bring in slow-moving cranes, heavy pontoons, and stationary support ships. These are not nimble patrol boats. They are massive, vulnerable targets that cannot maneuver or hide. The moment the salvage begins, the Soviet Navy will be inviting a storm of steel and fire upon its most specialized personnel. The environment itself adds another layer of difficulty. Even in midsummer, the waters of the Baltic Sea are unforgiving. The visibility at 88 feet is often non-existent, clouded by the churned-up silt of the seabed and the organic matter of the shallow sea. The currents can be deceptive, pulling at a diver's airlines and threatening to pin them against the jagged edges of the wrecked hull. Every hour spent at this depth increases the physiological toll on the human body, and every day the submarine remains on the bottom, the pressure of the sea works to crush its secrets. The German Luftwaffe remains a constant presence in the skies, searching for any sign of Soviet activity that might indicate a recovery effort is underway. Within the Soviet command, a fierce debate unfolds. One faction argues that the risk is simply too high. To lose a salvage fleet and hundreds of elite divers for a single submarine seems, on its face, like a catastrophic trade. They suggest a more conservative approach. Send small teams of divers down to retrieve specific items, the Enigma machine perhaps, or a few documents, and then destroy the wreck with explosives to prevent the Germans from ever reclaiming it. This hit-and-run strategy would minimize the time Soviet ships are exposed to enemy fire and would still yield some immediate intelligence. It is the logical choice for a military that is already stretched to its breaking point. However, the intelligence experts and the naval engineers see the situation differently. They argue that a partial salvage is, in many ways, worse than no salvage at all. Historian Rana Mitter has noted that the Soviet military-industrial complex of this era was deeply invested in the idea of, quote, total technical capture. The intelligence officers point out that opening a submarine's compartments underwater is a recipe for disaster. The moment a hatch is cracked or a hole is cut into the pressure hull, the rushing seawater will destroy everything inside. Paper documents, even those protected by metal boxes, would be reduced to pulp by the corrosive salt and the sudden change in pressure. The electronics are even more fragile. A naval Enigma machine is a precision instrument made of copper, steel, and delicate wiring. If it is exposed to salt water and then brought into the open air, the oxidation process begins almost instantly, fusing the rotors and destroying the very circuits that the engineers need to study. More importantly, the Soviet Union isn't just looking for objects, they are looking for a system. An acoustic torpedo is not just a tube of explosives. It is a complex web of sensors, batteries, and mechanical linkages. To understand how the torpedo hears, one must see how it is integrated into the submarine's own internal systems. Removing it piece by piece would strip away the context that makes the technology understandable. The cold, academic principle of intelligence gathering takes precedence. Information without context is merely noise. Systems must be studied as systems. If the Soviet Union wants to defeat the acoustic torpedo and break the German naval codes, they cannot settle for scraps. They need the entire vessel, preserved in its original state, with every wire, every logbook, and every mechanical part exactly where it was when the ship went down. They need to walk through the compartments and see the world through the eyes of the German crew. This is the only way to ensure that nothing is missed and that no detail is misinterpreted. The debate eventually reaches the highest levels of the Soviet military hierarchy. The decision-makers are faced with a cold calculation. On one side of the scale are the lives of the sailors and divers who will be sent into the line of fire. On the other side is the potential to save the entire Baltic Sea fleet from an invisible weapon. In the brutal logic of total war, the choice is clear. The future lives of thousands of men and the strategic survival of the fleet outweigh the present risk to the salvage crews. Information is valued higher than hardware, and it is certainly valued higher than the individual lives of those tasked with its retrieval. The final order is issued with a gravity that reflects the stakes. Raise the submarine intact. There are to be no shortcuts. No compartments are to be opened underwater. No holes are to be cut into the hull for convenience. The U-250 is to be lifted from the seabed as if it were a fragile archaeological specimen. It is a radical decision, one that pushes the Soviet salvage service, known as IPRON, to its absolute limit. IPRON is an organization born of necessity, specializing in the recovery of sunken ships from the freezing waters of the North and the Black Sea. But even for these veterans, the U-250 represents a challenge of a different order. This decision is not an act of bravery in the traditional sense. It is an act of extreme calculation. The Soviet Union is willing to commit an entire fleet of support vessels and their most skilled underwater laborers to a task that many consider impossible. They are prepared to endure the shelling of Finnish artillery and the bombing runs of the Luftwaffe for the sake of a few crates of paper and a handful of torpedoes. It is a testament to how much the invisible weapon has terrified the naval command. The fear of the unknown is a more powerful motivator than the fear of the enemy's guns. As the plans are drawn up, the operation is shrouded in a level of secrecy that is extraordinary even by Soviet standards. The men assigned to the mission are given only the most basic information. They are told that the task is of state importance, a phrase that carries a heavy, unspoken weight in the Stalinist era. It is a warning that failure will not be tolerated and that the details of the work are never to be discussed, even with fellow sailors. The site of the wreck is cordoned off, and the patrol boats that originally found the U-250 are ordered to maintain a constant, silent vigil. The technical requirements for the lift are staggering. To raise a 400-ton submarine from a depth of nearly 90 feet, the engineers must calculate the distribution of weight with surgical precision. The U-250 is resting on an uneven seabed, partially buried in silt and tilted to one side. If the lifting cables are not placed perfectly, the pressure of the lift could snap the submarine in half or cause it to roll, crushing the divers beneath it. The engineers must design a system of massive steel pontoons, known as camels, which will be submerged and attached to the hull. Once the air is pumped into these pontoons, the resulting buoyancy will slowly, agonizingly, pull the U-250 from its muddy grave. This is a battle of physics fought in a war zone. The Soviet commanders know that the Germans will eventually realize why they are lingering over the site. They know that every day the salvage ships sit motionless on the water, they are providing the enemy with a fixed target. The operation is a race against time, against the weather, and against an enemy who is only a few miles away. Yet, the order remains firm. The submarine must be raised whole. The secrets inside are deemed so precious that the Soviet Union is willing to risk its most specialized ships and men to bring a dead enemy back to the surface. Historian Philip Short has often described the Soviet approach to such high-stakes operations as a mix of profound technical ingenuity and a total disregard for individual safety. This is exactly what is required for the salvage of the U-250. It is a mission that demands the highest level of professional skill, performed under conditions that would break most men. The divers, many of whom have spent the war clearing mines and repairing damaged docks, now find themselves at the center of a secret war for information. They are the instruments of a state that sees them as a necessary sacrifice in the pursuit of a technological edge. As the first salvage vessels arrive at the site, the air is thick with the smell of diesel and the tension of men who know they are being watched. In the distance, the low hum of aircraft engines can be heard, and the horizon is marked by the dark shapes of the Finnish islands. The sea is calm, but beneath the surface, the U-250 sits in the darkness, a steel vault of secrets waiting to be cracked. The decision has been made, the ships are in position, and the men are ready to begin. They are about to enter the water not to fight a battle, but to retrieve the knowledge that might finally end the war in the Baltic Sea. The radical decision to raise the boat intact reflects a deep understanding of the nature of modern warfare. It recognizes that in the 20th century, the most powerful weapon is not a bigger gun or a faster ship, but a better understanding of the enemy's mind. The U-250 is the physical manifestation of that mind. Its codes, its charts, and its experimental weapons are the thoughts of the German Navy made into steel and ink. By bringing the submarine to the surface, the Soviet Union isn't just reclaiming metal. They are capturing the very essence of the enemy's naval strategy. The silence of the Gulf of Finland is about to be broken by the sound of air compressors and the splash of divers, as one of the most remarkable intelligence operations in history begins in earnest. At the same time, pressures continue to build, moving from the strategic maps of the High Command into the calloused hands of the men who must actually touch the seafloor. The technical ambition of the Soviet Union now rests on the shoulders of a very small, elite group of individuals. These are the divers of the Special Purpose Underwater Works Service, known by the Russian acronym EPRON. In the mid-1940s, these men are among the most specialized laborers in the world. They have spent the war years repairing the shattered bridges of Leningrad and clearing thousands of mines from the shipping lanes of the north. They are a breed of men defined by a quiet, professional stoicism, used to working in conditions where a single mistake results in a silent death. Only the most experienced veterans are chosen for the U-250 operation. The depth of the wreck, nearly 89 feet below the surface, sits at the very edge of the operational limits for the diving technology of the era. To go deeper would require complex gas mixtures that are not readily available in a war zone. At 89 feet, the water pressure is nearly 4 times that of the surface. Every movement is sluggish. Every breath of air from the surface pumps feels thick and heavy in the lungs. The men are encased in the 3-bolt diving suits of the time, heavy canvas and rubber garments topped with massive copper helmets. To an observer on the surface, they look like deep-sea monsters. Underwater, they are fragile humans tethered to life by a single pulsating hose. The environment of the Gulf of Finland is the diver's greatest adversary. Visibility is near zero. At the bottom, the light of the sun is a distant gray memory, filtered out by the silt and the brackish water. The divers often work in total darkness, navigating the jagged metal of the submarine by touch alone. They describe the sensation of working in a world of thick soup, where the silt from the seabed is easily disturbed, creating a cloud of blackness that clings to their viewports. Historian Philip Short has noted that in the Soviet military structure, specialized skill was often treated with a mixture of profound reverence and extreme, almost inhuman, demand. These divers are not given a choice. They are told that the task is of state importance, a phrase that carries the weight of a sacred oath. They are not told what is inside the submarine, only that they must not fail to bring it up. The first task is the most grueling, surveying the damaged hull. The U-250 is not sitting neatly on the seabed. It is tilted at a precarious angle, its bow buried deep in the soft mud, and its stern lifted slightly, as if it were still trying to climb toward the surface. The divers must move around the wreck with extreme caution. The hull is a mess of twisted steel, sharp edges, and tangled railings that can easily snag an airline or a lifeline. Working in pairs, they begin the slow process of routing 6 massive steel lifting cables beneath the submarine. This requires tunneling, using high-pressure water hoses to blast holes through the silt and stone beneath the pressure hull. It is a terrifying job. A diver must lie on his stomach in the mud, pushing a hose forward while the weight of a 400-ton submarine hangs just inches above his head. As they work, a new and terrifying danger reveals itself. The divers discover 3 live T5 Zaunkönig acoustic torpedoes lying in the mud near the hull, and 2 more still wedged in their external tubes. These are the very weapons the Soviet Union is so desperate to study, but in their current state, they are ticking time bombs. The sensitivity of their acoustic triggers is unknown. Any sharp sound, the clank of a metal tool against the hull, or the vibration of the water jets, could potentially detonate hundreds of pounds of high explosives. If one torpedo goes off, the resulting shockwave will not only destroy the U-250, but will instantly kill every diver in the water and likely sink the salvage ships on the surface. This is not the stress of active combat, where adrenaline provides a temporary shield. This is a sustained, existential risk that must be managed for hours at a time, day after day. The divers must work with a lightness of touch that seems impossible given their heavy equipment. They handle the steel cables and the high-pressure hoses with the delicacy of surgeons. There is no room for panic. In the silence of the deep, the only sound is the rhythmic thump hiss of the air pump and the diver's own steady breathing. It is a masterclass in professional discipline, performed in a world where the margin for error has completely vanished. By the middle of August, the cables are finally in place. The plan involves the use of 6 massive pontoons, or camels, giant steel cylinders that are flooded with water and sunk to the seabed alongside the wreck. The divers must secure the lifting cables to these pontoons, a process that takes days of exhausting labor. Once the cables are locked, air is pumped from the surface vessels into the pontoons, slowly displacing the water. This creates a powerful upward force. The goal is to distribute the weight of the submarine so evenly that it rises horizontally, like an elevator. On the day of the first lift attempt, the tension on the salvage ships is palpable. The air compressors roar to life, sending a steady stream of bubbles rising to the surface. Slowly, the massive steel cables begin to go taut. They hum with the immense strain, shedding droplets of water like beads of sweat. The U-250 is stubborn. The suction of the mud on the seabed is holding it fast. The engineers increase the air pressure, and for a long moment, nothing happens. Then, a dull, heavy groan vibrates through the water. The sound of steel and mud finally parting ways. The submarine begins its slow journey toward the surface. But success is short-lived. As the submarine reaches a depth of about 40 feet, one of the primary lifting cables begins to slip. It is a catastrophic moment. The redistribution of weight is instantaneous. The other cables begin to groan under the sudden, uneven load, and the massive steel pontoons start to tilt wildly. If the cables snap, the U-250 will plummet back to the seabed, likely breaking in two and crushing any chance of recovering its secrets. The operation is immediately halted. The submarine is lowered back down, but it is now in an even more precarious position than before, balanced awkwardly on its side. The command decides that a secondary line must be secured immediately. But the sun has already set, and the weather is beginning to turn. To wait for morning is to risk the submarine shifting again, or the enemy discovering the weakened state of the salvage fleet. A single diver is selected to go down, at night, to secure the line. The darkness of the Baltic Sea at night is absolute. The diver descends into a void, lit only by a small, handheld lamp that barely cuts through the silt. He works for 2 hours in the freezing cold, his fingers numb, his mind focused entirely on the placement of a single steel shackle. It is a moment of profound isolation and bravery, performed without the hope of an audience or the promise of a medal. He is a ghost working in a graveyard. As the second, successful lift finally brings the conning tower of the U-250 above the waves, the human drama is interrupted by the reality of the war. The Finnish coastal artillery, positioned on the nearby heights, has finally deduced what the Soviet fleet is doing. The first shells begin to fall, sending geysers of water erupting around the salvage convoy. The Finnish gunners are accurate, their shells whistling through the air and exploding with a terrifying roar. The Soviet ships are sitting ducks, slow, heavy, and tied to the sunken prize they have worked so hard to recover. The Soviet response is a masterclass in naval camouflage. Smoke-laying vessels, small and fast, begin to circle the salvage fleet, pumping out thick clouds of chemical white smoke. Within minutes, the entire area is blanketed in an artificial fog. The Finnish gunners can no longer see their targets, but they continue to fire blindly into the haze. The Soviet convoy begins to move, the tugboats straining against the dead weight of the U-250. They are moving blindly through the smoke, navigating by compass and the shouted orders of lookouts. There are no speeches on the decks of the Soviet ships. There is no cheering. There is only the grim, focused execution of procedures. The sailors and divers know that they are still within range of the enemy's guns, and the submarine hanging beneath them is still a volatile cage of explosives and secrets. The smoke provides a temporary sanctuary, but it also adds to the chaos. Ships move within feet of each other, their hulls nearly touching in the whiteout conditions. It is a slow-motion escape, a funeral procession moving through a cloud of sulfur and salt. Historian Sheila Fitzpatrick has often noted that the great achievements of the Soviet era were frequently built on this kind of invisible, grueling labor, work that was never meant to be publicized. The men on these ships do not feel like heroes. They feel like laborers who have just finished a shift in a particularly dangerous factory. Their bones ache from the cold, and their nerves are frayed from the constant threat of the torpedoes and the shells. As the convoy finally clears the range of the Finnish guns and heads toward the safety of the Kronstadt naval base, the sun begins to rise over a calm sea. The U-250 is finally out of the mud, but it is not yet safe. It is a dripping, barnacle-encrusted monster, trailing silt and oil as it is towed toward the docks. The men on the surface can finally see the ship they have been fighting for weeks. It is a haunting sight, a tomb of steel that has been dragged back into the light of day. The divers, exhausted and silent, watch from the railings of their support ships. They have done what was asked of them. They have performed the impossible under the eyes of the enemy. But as they look at the dark hull of the submarine, they know that their part of the story is ending, and a new, even more secretive chapter is about to begin. The steel coffin is coming home, and the secrets inside are finally within reach. But beneath the surface, subtle changes are already shaping the next steps, as the captive submarine is towed into the restricted waters of the Soviet naval docks. The arrival of the U-250 at the Kronstadt naval base is not marked by the cheering crowds or brass bands that usually greet a victorious fleet. Instead, the atmosphere is one of heavy, clinical silence. The area around the dry dock has been cleared of all non-essential personnel, replaced by a triple security perimeter of elite guards who have been ordered to shoot on sight anyone attempting to photograph the vessel. This is a forbidden zone, a place where the physical reality of the war is stripped of its propaganda and reduced to its raw, technical components. Historian Philip Short has noted that the Soviet obsession with secrecy often reached its peak when dealing with captured foreign technology. The U-250 is treated not as a trophy of war, but as a crime scene of immense strategic importance. No member of the press is allowed within miles of the base, and even high-ranking naval officers find themselves barred from the dock unless they possess specific technical clearances. The goal is total containment. The Soviet command understands that if the Germans learn that the submarine has been successfully brought to a dock, the value of the intelligence inside will plummet as the enemy changes their codes and modifies their weapons. The first men who approach the dripping, silt-covered hull are not engineers or intelligence officers, but sappers. These are the explosives experts whose job it is to ensure the steel coffin is not a giant booby trap. There is a pervasive fear that the German crew, in their final moments, may have set dead man's switches, explosive charges designed to detonate the moment a hatch is opened or a specific valve is turned. The sappers move with agonizing slowness, their ears pressed against the cold steel, listening for the faint tick of a timer or the hiss of a chemical fuse. They work in a world of shadows, illuminated only by the harsh glare of industrial floodlights. Each hatch is treated as a potential gateway to disaster. The sappers use specialized tools to crack the seals, standing back as the internal pressure of the submarine equalizes with the outside air. A foul, heavy stench of diesel fuel, stagnant seawater, and the unmistakable scent of human decay wafts from the openings. It is a reminder that, while this is a technical mission for the High Command, for the men on the dock, it is a grim encounter with the reality of death. One by one, the hatches are secured and the all clear is given. The interior of the U-250 is finally open to the investigators. The inspection of the compartments is a surreal journey into a frozen moment in time. Inside, the world of July 1944 is perfectly preserved. The submarine is a mess of overturned chairs, floating papers, and personal effects. A half-eaten meal in the galley, a photograph of a family tucked into a bunk, a stack of letters that will never be sent. The investigators must move through the mud and the debris, carefully documenting the position of every switch and dial. Historian Sheila Fitzpatrick has described the Soviet approach to this kind of technical recovery as a form of industrial forensics, where the goal is to reconstruct the entire operating logic of the enemy's military machine. As the investigators move deeper into the hull, they encounter the remains of the German sailors who did not survive the sinking. It is a somber task, removing the bodies of men who were, until recently, the most feared hunters of the Baltic Sea. There is a quiet respect in the way the Soviet teams handle the dead, a recognition of the shared hardship of life at sea. But the emotional weight of the discovery is quickly superseded by the technical mission. The bodies are removed so that the intelligence officers can reach the heart of the ship, the radio room and the commander's cabin. In the radio room, the search pays off in a way that exceeds the command's wildest expectations. Resting in its cradle, protected from the worst of the flooding by its position in the upper reaches of the compartment, is a naval Enigma machine, specifically the Schlüssel M, the four-rotor version used by the U-boat service. It is intact, its brass rotors still bright, and its wiring undisturbed. Even more valuable are the documents found nearby. Because the submarine was on its first patrol, the codebooks are crisp and complete, containing the daily key settings for the weeks ahead. This is the holy grail of naval intelligence, a discovery that effectively turns the German radio network into an open book. At the same time, technical teams are working in the torpedo room at the bow of the ship. Here, they find the primary reason for the entire operation: the T5 Zaunkönig acoustic torpedoes. These weapons are over 23 feet long and carry a warhead filled with nearly 600 pounds of high explosives. Two of them are still nestled in their tubes, their delicate internal microphones and guidance systems waiting for a sound that will never come. The engineers treat these weapons with a mixture of awe and terror. They are looking at the future of naval warfare, a weapon that uses physics to hunt its prey. The recovery of the technical manuals for the T-5 Zaunkönig is a breakthrough of equal importance. These documents explain the precise frequency ranges the torpedo's microphones are tuned to and the logic of its steering mechanism. They reveal a critical weakness. The torpedo is designed to home in on the loudest sound it hears, which is usually the cavitation of a ship's propeller. But it cannot distinguish between the sound of a real ship and a simulated noise. This single piece of information is the key to the entire defense of the Soviet Navy. If the Soviet Union can create a device that makes a louder, more convincing noise than a ship, the torpedo will follow them, ghost instead of the vessel. The operational effects of these discoveries are almost immediate. Within days of their recovery, Soviet naval intelligence begins to decrypt intercepted German radio traffic. One of the first successes is the interception of a secret German mine-laying operation. By reading the encrypted orders, the Soviet command knows exactly when and where the German ships will be. A trap is set, and a German U-boat, operating under the assumption that it is invisible and unheard, is ambushed and destroyed. The hunter has become the hunted, and the iron gardens of the Gulf of Finland are no longer a mystery to the Soviet navigators. The minefield charts recovered from the U-250's command center are quickly duplicated and distributed to the captains of the Soviet patrol fleet. For the first time in years, the Soviet Navy can move through the Gulf of Finland with confidence. They now possess the secret safe lanes used by the Germans, allowing them to bypass the most dangerous minefields and strike at the enemy from unexpected angles. The geography of the sea has been rewritten in favor of the Soviet Union. Every ship saved and every mission successfully completed is a direct result of the secrets dragged from the mud of the Koivisto Islands. In the laboratories of Leningrad, Soviet engineers begin a frantic program to develop noise decoys based on the T-5 Zaunkönig's technical manuals. These devices, simple in concept but sophisticated in execution, consist of metal bars that are towed behind a ship. When the water flows over them, they vibrate at a specific frequency that mimics the sound of a large propeller, but at a much higher volume. To an acoustic torpedo, this decoy sounds like a massive, irresistible target. The weapon steers itself toward the vibrating bars, exploding harmlessly in the wake of the ship, hundreds of feet from the actual hull. This rapid technical mobilization is a hallmark of the Soviet war effort. The transition from capturing a weapon to deploying a countermeasure is measured in weeks rather than months. The engineers work around the clock, fueled by the knowledge that their work will prevent the kind of catastrophic losses seen with the Amohu 05. The U-250 has provided the raw data, and the Soviet scientific establishment is turning that data into a shield. It is a victory of the mind, achieved through the physical labor of the divers and the clinical precision of the investigators. Yet, as the secrets are extracted and the weapons are analyzed, the veil of secrecy around the U-250 only thickens. The men who opened the steel coffin and the engineers who dissected the T-5 Zaunkönig are sworn to absolute silence. They are forbidden from discussing their work with their families, or even their fellow officers. The success of the operation depends on the Germans remaining in the dark. If the enemy suspects their technology has been compromised, they will simply iterate and improve, and the advantage gained at such a high cost will be lost. The U-250 itself, once its secrets have been stripped away, becomes a hollow shell, a ghost of a ship that no longer has a story to tell to the outside world. It sits in the dry dock, a silent witness to one of the most successful intelligence hauls of the 20th century. The discoveries made within its cramped, oil-slicked compartments have changed the course of the naval war in the North, saving countless lives and shifting the strategic balance of the Baltic Sea. But for the men who walked through its flooded corridors and touched the cold steel of its invisible weapons, the experience is something that must be buried deep within their memories, hidden away like the submarine itself. As the summer of 1944 fades into autumn, the Soviet Union possesses a level of naval intelligence that was unthinkable only months before. They can hear the enemy's thoughts, they can see the enemy's paths, and they can defeat the enemy's most advanced weapons. The U-250 was raised for information, and that information has been delivered in abundance. But the price of this knowledge is a lifetime of silence. The story of the steel coffin is being written in the secret files of the High Command, even as the world remains entirely unaware that the U-250 was ever anything more than another sunken wreck at the bottom of a shallow sea. As the months unfold, the echoes of the salvage operation begin to quiet, replaced by the relentless, grinding noise of the Soviet advance toward Berlin. On the surface of the Gulf of Finland, the waters return to their usual state of gray, churning unrest. The cranes and pontoons that once crowded the site of the U-250 are gone, and the triple security perimeter at the Kronstadt docks remains as impenetrable as ever. To the outside world, the U-250 is merely a name on a list of sunken holes, a minor casualty in a global conflagration that claims thousands of lives every day. The official Soviet announcement regarding the encounter is brief and devoid of detail. An enemy submarine has been sunk. There is no mention of the divers who worked in the freezing mud, no word of the acoustic torpedoes recovered, and certainly no hint that the submarine has been raised from its grave. This official silence is not a matter of modesty. It is a strategic necessity. In the world of high-stakes intelligence, the greatest weapon is often the enemy's ignorance. The Soviet High Command understands that the value of everything they have recovered depends entirely on the German Navy believing that the U-250 is still resting at the bottom of the sea, its secrets safely buried under 90 feet of water and silt. If Berlin were to discover that their most advanced encryption machine and their revolutionary homing torpedoes were in Soviet hands, the advantage gained would vanish in a heartbeat. Codes would be changed immediately, minefields would be repositioned, and the guidance systems of the T-5 Zaunkönig torpedoes would be redesigned to account for the new Soviet decoys. The logic of military secrecy creates a strange, double-blind reality. The Soviet Navy begins to use the information they have gathered, but they must do so with extreme caution. When they intercept a German convoy or ambush a U-boat using decrypted radio traffic, they must make it appear as though the success was the result of a lucky patrol or a routine aerial sighting. They cannot afford to be too successful, lest the Germans begin to suspect their communications are compromised. This shadow war requires a level of restraint that is often difficult to maintain in the heat of a total conflict. Every decision is filtered through the lens of preservation. How much of the secret can be used today without losing the ability to use it tomorrow? Historian Orlando Figes, in his reflections on the internal mechanics of the Soviet state, has often noted that secrecy in this era was not just a military tactic, but a fundamental way of life. The culture of the closed file permeated every level of the administration. In the case of the U-250, this systemic inertia meant that the operation was essentially erased from the public record the moment it was completed. The reports were classified at the highest possible level, and the physical evidence was moved to restricted research institutes where it could be studied by only a handful of senior scientists. Even within the Soviet military itself, only a tiny fraction of the officer corps was ever aware that the salvage had even taken place. There is a profound counterintelligence reality at play here as well. The more people who are aware of a secret, the more likely that secret is to leak. By keeping the circle of knowledge as small as possible, the Soviet Union protects itself from the accidental slip of a tongue in a dockside tavern or a poorly phrased entry in a personal journal. In the Soviet system, information is treated like a rare and volatile chemical. It is only handled by those with the proper equipment and only in the exact amounts necessary for the task at hand. This compartmentalization ensures that even if one individual were to be captured or compromised, they could only reveal a tiny fragment of the larger picture. As time passes, the secrecy around the U-250 begins to take on a life of its own. It is often easier for a bureaucracy to keep a secret than it is to justify revealing it. Once an operation has been labeled top secret, the momentum of the state keeps it that way for decades, long after the original strategic reasons for the silence have faded. The U-250 becomes a ghost in the archives, a story that no one is allowed to tell because the rules of the system forbid it. The urgency of the 1944 salvage is replaced by the cold, stagnant silence of the Cold War, where the submarine's secrets are kept hidden not from the Germans, but from the world at large. The human cost of this silence is perhaps the most poignant part of the story. The divers, the sappers, and the sailors who performed the impossible in the summer of 1944 are given no public recognition. There are no parades through the streets of Moscow for the men who secured the cables or the engineers who dissected the acoustic torpedoes. Decorations are indeed awarded, but they are handed out in private offices, behind closed doors, and the citations are written in a vague, antiseptic language that masks the true nature of the heroism involved. A diver might receive a medal for exemplary performance of duty in a combat environment, a phrase that tells his family and his neighbors absolutely nothing about the hours he spent trapped under a 400-ton hull in the dark. These men are forbidden to speak of their work, even to each other, for decades. They carry the weight of their experiences alone, unable to share the details of their survival or the significance of what they achieved. Historian Sheila Fitzpatrick has noted that this kind of invisible labor was the backbone of the Soviet war effort. Yet it left many veterans feeling like ghosts in their own country. They watched as the history books were written, focusing on the grand battles of tanks and infantry, while the silent technical victory they had won in the Gulf of Finland was ignored. Most of these participants would pass away before the truth of the U-250 was finally declassified in the late 20th century, taking their memories of the, quote, steel coffin to their own graves. The silence also extended to the families of the German sailors who perished on the U-250. For 50 years, the fate of the crew was a mystery, their final resting place officially listed as unknown. Because the Soviet Union refused to acknowledge the salvage, the bodies that had been removed from the hull were buried in unmarked graves, their identities lost to the bureaucracy of the state. It was not until the fall of the Soviet Union that the records were opened and the families of the fallen could finally learn the truth of what had happened to their loved ones in the shallow waters of the Baltic Sea. Ultimately, the story of the U-250 is a reminder that history is not just a collection of dates and battles, but a complex tapestry of things hidden and things revealed. The success of the operation was measured not in territory gained, but in the quiet accumulation of knowledge. The Soviet Union risked men, ships, and its own reputation to raise a shattered submarine because they understood that in the modern world, information is the ultimate currency. They bought that information with the courage of their divers and preserved it with the absolute silence of their state. The U-250 changed the war not with a bang, but with a whisper, providing the keys to a kingdom of secrets that the enemy never even knew had been lost. As we look back at the dark, still waters of the Gulf of Finland, we are reminded that the greatest achievements of history are often those that leave no trace on the surface. We are drawn to the stories of grand maneuvers and thunderous victories, yet so much of our world has been shaped by the quiet, invisible labor of those who work in the shadows. The men who raised the U-250 did not do so for glory, and they did not do so for the sake of the history books. They did so because they were asked to perform a task of immense difficulty under impossible conditions, and they had the professional discipline to see it through to the end. This story is a testament to the power of human ingenuity and the profound weight of a secret. It tells us that wars are not just won by the strength of arms, but by the strength of the mind. The U-250 was a vessel of death, but in its recovery, it became a vessel of life for the thousands of Soviet sailors who were saved by the countermeasures developed from its wreckage. It is a story of cold calculations and warm human endurance, a narrative of a time when the world was on fire and the future was decided by those who could operate in the dark. When we consider the silence that followed the operation, we shouldn't see it only as a product of a specific political system, but as a reflection of the nature of intelligence itself. Some truths are so powerful that they must be buried to remain effective. The U-250 was raised to be studied, then hidden to be used. It remains a haunting symbol of the hidden history of the 20th century, a reminder that beneath every calm sea, there are stories of sacrifice and discovery that may never be fully told. We honor the memory of those who worked in the silt and the smoke, not because we know their names, but because we understand the value of the silence they maintained. Thank you for spending part of your day with us. If this journey into the hidden depths of history meant something to you, we'd be honored to have you with us again. Until next time, stay curious and take good care.